So, we are picking up right where we left off in the last lecture and continuing to talk about the role of Congress um, as listed or explained in the Constitution. But this time, when we talk about Congress, we are talking about Congress as a whole body and not as two separate chambers. So, when we talk about Congress in your notes, um, make sure that you distinguish now that we are talking about both the House of Representatives and the Senate and not just the House of Representatives. A lot of times when we hear about Congress in the news or we hear about Congress in conversation, a lot of people are often just talking about the House of Representatives. And this particular time, we are talking about both chambers. And so when we are talking about the functions of Congress, here's what we mean. We are talking about the primary purposes of Congress, and of course, first and foremost, it is lawmaking. And so, when we talk about what is the function of lawmaking or whatever, what you have to understand is in the Constitution it is Congress's responsibility to create law. Only Congress makes the law. Only Congress can create or write the law. Now, your immediate question might be, well, what is it that the president does then? Now, the president's role and responsibility has evolved quite a bit over the last 200 years. Since George Washington, it has evolved. The definition of the president's role has changed quite a bit. So we're going to get into that later on, and how the president has interpreted the Constitution has changed. It depends on the president that you are talking about, right? But when we talk about what is explicitly stated in the Constitution, it says that only Congress can make the law. Now, in response to that, what you have to understand is the president can veto that law that Congress creates, and the Supreme Court can declare a law unconstitutional, but only Congress can make the law. So it is the Supreme Court's responsibility to uh, look at a law and make sure that the law abides by or is within the limits of the Constitution. It is the president's responsibility to review the law. And if the president does not believe that that law is something that he can support, then he is within his rights to veto it. Then, of course, it goes back to Congress, and Congress can override that veto. So there are rules and regulations to that, but only Congress can write the law. Congress also has the responsibility to represent. Representation is the core value and core responsibility of Congress, in that you have a responsibility as the legislative body to represent the states and represent the people. A member of Congress that votes the way their constituents want them to vote is known as an instructed delegate. An instructed delegate. In other words, you are someone who is doing exactly what it is that your constituents want you to do. However, if you are voting in a sense that you believe is what is best for your constituents, best for your state, best for the country, then you are known as a trustee. So I'm going to say that again because it's important to remember. If you are a representative that is voting exactly as your constituents want you to vote, then you are known as an instructed delegate. So as they instruct you, that's how you vote. However, if you are voting exactly as your conscience tells you to vote, if you are voting because you think that this is what is in the best interest of your county, of your district, of your people, of your state, if you think, you know what, I know my people don't agree with this, but I think in the long run, this is what would be in their best interest. This is what best reflects the Constitution, and this is how I'm going to vote. Then you are known as a trustee. That's the difference. Representation doesn't always necessarily mean that you are going to represent them true to what the people want, because as some of the founding fathers would tell you, not everybody is going to know exactly what is right at all times. You, as a leader, have a responsibility not to do exactly what the people tell you, but to do what is right for the people, what is right for the country, and what is right according to the Constitution. And that's your responsibility as a leader. And here's the thing to keep in mind. Not everybody is meant to be a leader. Leadership is not meant for everybody. It is a difficult job. It has a tremendous amount of responsibility, and this is precisely why. Leadership means that you have to be out in front, and you have to be willing to make sacrifices. You have to be willing to make decisions that are difficult, and you have to be willing to think ahead and not just think about the immediate. And so that's what being a trustee would be like, right? Making difficult decisions in that sense. Okay, so another function of Congress, of course, would be setting the budget, and that's the national budget. Congress controls the money, and Congress controls the funding. So, how much money the country has and how the country is going to spend it is up to Congress. Right now, the country is in the middle of discussion and debate. Congress is in the middle of a discussion and debate on how the national budget is going to be spent. Right now, it's in the middle of it is currently holding at a stipulation, and essentially there is an agreement to hold at this stipulation until, for now, it's at a pause until the next time budget talks come up. But if budget talks don't come to an agreement, then there's going to be a government shutdown. Um, that's the thing. You have to come to an agreement on how that budget is going to be spent, where funding is going to go, what will be prioritized, how much of the money will be prioritized to what. So that's going to be everything from the military to healthcare to education to public spending projects like everything from highways to anything that affects the public to things like that. And so it really depends on, who you have in Congress dominating Congress. So if the Republicans are in charge, then the Republican agenda is going to dominate the budget, and vice versa. Another function of Congress is overseeing the federal bureaucracy. By that, that means that they are going to be in charge of who's in charge of what agencies, how these agencies run. Agencies like Veterans Affairs, agencies like you, dealing with national parks, agencies like dealing with Indian affairs, anything that deals with the federal government, any and every office dealing with the federal government, that's what Congress is going to be in charge of. And of course, there's public education. Keeping the public informed on important issues dealing with public education, that's what Congress is going to be right in the heart of. So when it comes to public education, and funding for public education, that's where Congress is right there going to be in the middle of. And then, of course, there's this large, broad way of putting things, but solving the problems and issues facing the American people and the country. So everything from national security to global warming and everything in between, right? Whether it's the pandemic or unemployment, these are the issues that Congress is going to take on. And it's not very easy to take on all of these issues all at once. And that's a part of the reason why um, is Congress gets very little done because there's a lot to do, right? And so, in the grand scheme of things, you have to figure out what it is that you're going to prioritize and what it is that's going to be placed on the back burner, right? And it all sort of depends on which party has control of Congress and what's going on at the same time. Like, for example, right now, with everything that's going on in Ukraine and with Russia having declared um, that it has sent in troops or it's sending in troops to take over a couple of parts of Ukraine. All eyes are on questions of national security or international security and what the United States is going to do with NATO. Well, then, if that's the case, then that means that there are certain issues that probably aren't going to get a whole lot of attention right now because this is going to get the priority. That's how it usually goes, right? Now, while those were the functions of Congress and the jobs of Congress, we have to talk about the powers of Congress, right? What is Congress able to do? Um, so if you were to look in the Constitution itself, which by the way, you do have access to the Constitution, you can Google it and you can actually find it online. So if you were to actually Google the US Constitution, you would be able to find the Constitution's um, description of the powers of Congress in Article 1, Section 8, in clauses 1 through 17. The first 17 powers listed there are known as the enumerated powers of Congress. The enumerated powers of Congress. And then there is something known as the implied powers of Congress. Okay. And the implied powers of Congress is in Clause 18. So I want to explain what enumerated powers mean versus implied powers. Okay, so enumerated powers, meaning the word enumerated means numbered, right? The actual numbered or listed powers of Congress. So the enumerated powers are specific powers of Congress. They are actually listed. These powers are actually described in writing. You can see it for yourself in black and white in the Constitution. These are listed powers. There's no discussion, no debate. It's right there in front of your face. So the enumerated powers are in clauses 1 through 17. The implied powers of Congress, which is in clause 18, is right there in the term implied, right? Implied powers of Congress are essentially it's implied means I don't have to list them. It's just implied. You know it by the simple understanding. It's common sense. It's logical that Congress would have this power. It's simple, basic logic. Okay. So I want to talk about what the enumerated powers of Congress are. First of all, the enumerated power of Congress is to give taxes, to issue taxes to the American people. Think about this for a second and how important that is. In the Articles of Confederation, which had been the previous law of the land, Congress did not have that power. And that was really problematic because when Congress did not have the power to issue taxes, the federal government had no money. So it was specifically needed in the Constitution to write out in ink that Congress had the power to issue taxes. It also says in the Constitution that Congress has the power to borrow money without limit. It has the power to borrow money without limit. In other words, it's establishing credit for the United States. It's establishing a form of credit. You can borrow money without limit. This is very Alexander Hamilton in its nature. It can also establish a uniform commercial policy. A uniform commercial policy. In other words, it can establish a policy in which you have a relationship, a relationship with a trade relationship or a commerce relationship with other countries, right? It also establishes that Congress has the power to determine citizenship. Congress also has the power to declare bankruptcies. Congress has the power and authority over the post office, as well as patents and copyrights. Congress has the power to establish the currency of the United States. It has the power to establish a federal court. It has the power to declare war. Not the President of the United States. The President of the United States cannot declare war. Hear me now. The President cannot declare war. Only Congress can declare war. And on that note, Congress is the only power in the federal government to establish and regulate the military and the Navy. And that's because Congress, remember, has the power to determine the budget, right? So within their budget, they're the ones who determine, how much money is given to the military in the first place. So because of that, one of their enumerated powers is to establish and regulate the military and the Navy. They also are the ones who actually control Washington, D.C. So when the mayor of Washington, D.C. Has an issue, and this continues to this day, if the mayor of Washington, D.C. has a problem, the mayor of Washington, D.C. actually has to go and deal with Congress, not the president, but Congress. So Congress actually is in charge of Washington, D.C. The mayor of Washington, D.C. is subject to the United States Congress. Now, on that note, here are the powers denied to Congress. This is listed in Section 9 of the Constitution. So, I want you to notice that the Constitution explicitly states that Congress cannot end international slave trade. And this is true until 1808. And notice how important this is that they established this in the Constitution. And this is all thanks to the fact that there is the Three-Fifths Compromise. It's important that you make that connection. Without the Three-Fifths Compromise, this would not have been possible. The Three-Fifths Compromise makes this particular limitation possible. Southerners carry so much influence that they are able to make this particular clause possible. Okay? Congress cannot end international slave trade. That does not end until 1808. There are no ex post facto laws. Congress cannot establish ex post facto laws, meaning ex post facto laws refer to punishing someone for a crime that was not a crime when it was committed. So, in other words, let's say I stole something. But when I stole it, stealing it wasn't actually a crime when I committed it. It only became a crime after I stole it. I cannot be punished for that. I cannot be retroactively punished, right? Anyone who commits that crime after the law is punished, they can be punished. But you can't go back and punish all of the people who broke the law before the law was passed. That's what ex post facto means. You cannot go back and punish people for breaking the law before the law was the law. That's the idea. The other thing that Congress cannot do, they cannot establish bills of attainder. In other words, you cannot punish someone without a lawful trial. You cannot punish someone without a lawful trial. You cannot punish someone without a lawful trial. You cannot give a tax per person. No head tax. You cannot tax per person. Tax per family, not per person. Now, if you are taxing as one person, as a single person, then yes, you are taxed. But if you are filing on behalf of a family, then you are taxed as a family and not as four individuals. No head tax, meaning you are taxed. If you are filing your taxes as a family, then that's how you are taxed, not as individuals. There are no titles of nobility established by Congress. You will notice that in the United States, we do not have knights or ladies. We do not have any kind of nobility whatsoever. And that is specifically because we wanted to make sure that from the very beginning, there is a clear sense of equality, that there is no sense of who's higher than or lower than anyone else, except, of course, in the sense of economic inequality, right? But even then, there is no, even with landed um, people with land and without land, you don't have the distinction of having a title that's assigned to you. There is no preference given to one state or its ports. So, for example, Congress is not going to make a trade deal with England or with France, um, and saying to them, hey, we will give you an extra large discount if you use the ports in Massachusetts rather than the ports in Charleston, South Carolina, or the ports in New Orleans, Louisiana. You can't do that. They can use whatever port is easiest for them, whatever port is readily available for them. In other words, you cannot show favoritism to any state or any port or any trading spot. You have to be fair to everyone. No suspension, no export tax. No export tax. Export tax, of course, is the tax on trade goods sent out of the United States. Congress cannot issue taxes on goods sent out of the United States. Now, that does not mean that companies or businesses do not pay taxes on things that they sell outside of the United States. That's not true at all. If a business was to sell something to somebody else, in Europe, Europe perhaps has import taxes on, so taxes on goods brought into their countries. So there are taxes there, but Congress cannot issue an export tax. Congress cannot suspend habeas corpus except for in the case of emergencies. Congress cannot suspend habeas corpus except for in the case of emergencies. So let me explain what habeas corpus is. So habeas corpus is basically a legal document that is required when um, a person who is under arrest needs to be brought before a judge or brought into court to see a judge. Okay. So you can't just arrest someone and throw them into jail and leave them there. Habeas corpus basically says you need to bring them before a judge and make sure the judge sees them. Um, and so, in other words, you've got to make sure that um, you have to make sure that there are reasons behind their detention. You have to make sure that there are legal reasons behind their imprisonment. You can't just throw them in jail and leave it as is. Okay. Um, unless there is an emergency being national security or war or whatever. Abraham Lincoln is going to suspend habeas corpus during the Civil War. Um, so that's what Congress is limited in doing. Congress cannot just limit habeas corpus because they feel like it. Okay. In the actually, you know what? Let me go back here for a second. When we talk about here we go. When we talk about the powers of what Congress cannot do, one of the things that you have to make sure that you understand here is that you're going to run into this a lot, that the Constitution um, will list this for each branch of the federal government. Here's what you can do, here's what you cannot do. And that is on purpose. They purposely go out of their way to make sure that there are lists of the powers that they have, but there are also limits to the powers that they have. And that's intentional. So, from powers denied to Congress, we now go to powers denied to the states, which is in Section 10. And uh, states can't do whatever they want to do. As much as um, states want to be able to have autonomy and do whatever they want to do. One of the things that James Madison and Hamilton and others like them want to make sure that they establish in the Constitution is the final authority of the federal government, right? So there is this recognition that states do and should have a certain level of autonomy. They shouldn't have the final autonomy. And that's really important to them. So, everything that is denied to Congress in terms of power is denied to the states. So, states can't, for example, establish rules on citizenship. States can't, or not rules on citizenship. My apologies. States can't and or they can't punish someone without a lawful trial. They can't punish someone retroactively. Those are the sort of things that are denied to the states. States cannot have or set import taxes. So if something is brought in from a foreign country, the state of Oklahoma cannot bring in or design an import tax. You can't have your own import taxes like that. States cannot tax each other. Oklahoma cannot tax Texas and vice versa. Um, Deal with it. You can't have your own kind of rules that way. State militias are okay, and in fact, we have every state has a national guard, but ultimately, the federal government has the final say on how those national guards are used. Um, and in fact, the federal government has the right to mobilize those state uh, national guards anytime it wants. So Governor Stitt can mobilize the Oklahoma National Guard when needed. But if President Biden says, you know what, I need the Oklahoma National Guard to move into the Ukraine, or I need the Oklahoma National Guard to move somewhere else, then as President of the United States, he has the authority to do that, because not only is he President of the United States, he's the Commander in Chief. And it does not matter what Governor Stitt says or whether or not he agrees, because that's federal authority, right? So that's usually how it works. And in fact, when the civil rights movement was taking place in the 1950s, you see that happen often. A governor would use the National Guard to prevent the integration of, say, a school, and the president, in this case, President Dwight Eisenhower, would then federalize the National Guard and say, nope, I'm going to use the National Guard to escort Black students into the school. So the federal government has the final say. The states cannot create treaties on their own. You cannot have treaties between Oklahoma and Canada, or Oklahoma and Mexico. Whatever treaty the United States signs with Canada or Mexico or Belgium is acknowledged and agreed upon, not only is by every single state, including the state that you live in. It is assumed that when the United States agrees to any treaty, it ratifies any treaty, then it includes all 50 states. And on that note, a state cannot create its own currency. There was a time, in the very beginning of the United States, when each state would have its own currency, and it caused absolute economic chaos. There was a matter of inflation. It was a matter of just uh, just absolute madness, because you could not travel from one state to another and have economic stability. And so, as a result, you had to have a federal government that established one currency for the entire country, and that was the currency that was used everywhere. So my dollar here in Oklahoma is good to use up in Montana, or over in New Hampshire, or over in California, and it's good everywhere. Okay, so on that note, I want to talk about how the Constitution has also established formal leadership positions in both the House and the Senate. So, when we talk about these formal leadership positions, one of the things that you have to understand is these formal leadership positions establish structure and are designed to create a sense of stability and order in both chambers of Congress. And that's what is really most important. So the House is presided by the Speaker of the House. And it is a constitutionally mandated position, but there are no qualifications to be the Speaker. So in theory, technically, you don't even have to be a member of the House. Um, so, uh, I mean, that's something to think about if you want. So, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, um, the Speaker of the House enjoyed a tremendous amount of power. Um, but uh, what's happened since then is you've seen sort of a shift in how other positions in the House of Representatives have risen to power and have risen to a larger sense of influence. And so the speaker doesn't have as much power as they used to. And so in the last several decades, I mean, going back to the 19 I would say the 1950s, you don't have a speaker that has nearly as much power as they used to have. They are still definitely, um, you know, names that you remember, but you don't necessarily have the same kind of power as they had before. So currently, the Speaker of the House is Nancy Pelosi. She is the first woman to ever hold the position of Speaker of the House. The speaker is selected from the majority party, but everyone in the House gets to vote on who the Speaker of the House gets to be. In terms of the responsibilities of the Speaker presides over the House first and foremost. Um, she schedules which bills need to be voted on, which is important. She selects committee members for each committee that the House has, and there are several committees. So there are multiple committees, and each committee has multiple committee members. And the thing is that with each committee and each committee member, um, both parties will give recommendations and tell her, okay, we want these people to serve on the committee, so it's not like she's making the entire decision by herself. Also, the Speaker of the House votes in the House of Representatives if there is a tie. In addition to that, according to the 1947 Presidential Succession Act, I'm going to say that again, the 1947 Presidential Succession Act, the Speaker of the House will become president if both the presidency and the vice presidency are vacant. So if something happens to the president and the vice president, then the Speaker of the House becomes president of the United States. So technically, according to the Constitution, now as it stands, the Speaker of the House is the third most powerful person in the United States. Okay. Now, in terms of leadership positions, the Senate is a bit less formal. Remember, I told you in the last lecture that there are fewer rules, primarily because the Senate is supposed to foster closer relationships. You're supposed to develop relationships with your fellow senators that you are supposed to have relationships where you can have real conversations with people that lead to compromise, that lead to partnerships, and that sort of thing. Um, the body of the Senate is actually presided over by the Vice President of the United States. And so right now, the Vice President of the United States is Vice President Kamala Harris. So the Vice President actually has three major responsibilities. She presides over uh, the Senate. And if there is a tie in the Senate, she will cast a vote. So if there is a tie, and right now, um, the Senate is actually pretty close to each other in terms of how the Senate is divided, right? Because there are 50, yeah, there are 51, 52 Democrats, and so it's pretty close to each other, but there's been a lot of back and forth because there have been a couple of Democrats who have voted with Republicans, and there's been a lot of back and forth, right? And so the vice president has had to preside over those debates. So she presides over the Senate. She casts a vote if there's a tie in the Senate. And third, she will succeed the president if there is a case of death or there is a case of resignation. Now, again, if the VP is not available to uh, serve in the Senate, then the president pro tem will preside over the Senate. The president pro tem is basically the Latin term essentially for the temporary president, the substitute president of the Senate. This is essentially a an honorary and a ceremonial position, and this is the ceremonial position that's given to the senior senator um, from the majority party. Um, and when we talk about, um, you know, the whole idea of um, being, this is the whole point of being the, being in the Senate. When we talk about being president pro tem of um, being the Senate. Currently, it is Patrick Leahy of Vermont. He is uh, he's the Democrat um, from Vermont. He's I don't know how long he's been there, but he's been there for a while. But he's been president pro tem before. He was president pro tem from 2012 to 2015, and then when the Democrats won the Senate last year, he became president pro tem again. So it's really just a ceremonial position. So if Vice President Harris is out of town or busy or out of country or and cannot be there at the Senate, in the Senate, Patrick Leahy of Vermont um, uh, presides over the, over the Senate. So in terms of the legislative Congress and the process of Congress, right now you have the 117th Congress in session. Congress meets from this particular Congress is meeting from January 3rd, 2021 to January of 2023. It should be January 3rd, 2023. I'm sorry, it doesn't say that on the screen. Um, Here's the thing, in terms of who gets to introduce legislation, it can be anyone. It can be anybody. Anyone can suggest legislation. The thing is, most of the legislation is suggested by the president. Most of the legislation is suggested by the president. But the key word here, and this is important, the key word, and I'm going to underline this, is this word right here, suggested. Because in order for um, you to actually introduce a bill to this Congress, you have to be a member of Congress. Okay. And you can be in the House, you can be in the Senate, but you have to be a member of Congress. You can't be the president of the United States. So it takes a member of Congress to introduce legislation, but the president can suggest it. And most legislation is suggested by the president of the United States. When we talk about the actual process of introducing a bill and how it goes, this is how it actually turns out in the House. So, from the time a bill is introduced in the House, it goes to a couple of different versions. For example, anytime a bill is introduced, both the House and the Senate work on different versions. Each version of the bill is given a number. So every bill is always given a number. In the House, from the time it's introduced, it goes to a standing committee. and it's going to go to the standing committee that it is most likely to be associated with. So, for example, if the bill is about um, something to do with price support for farmers, then it's going to go to the agricultural committee. And that's the same thing that would happen in the Senate. Okay. So then from the standing committee, here's the thing, a standing committee, digression, standing committee is basically a permanent committee in Congress. So the House has 20 permanent committees, it has 20 standing committees. That's why it's known as a standing committee. It is permanent. Senate has 17. Um, if it gets to the standing committee has to review the bill. The standing committee is what will determine whether or not that bill is even worth the time, the attention, the debate, um, to be on the floor of the House or the Senate. Um, the thing is, in order to be on the standing committee, it is determined by congressional seniority and that sort of thing, right? So congressional seniority has a really big role um, in order to determine, what committee you're going to be on and that sort of thing. Your expertise, of course, is going to be important, but seniority is a big deal. So once it gets to the standing committee, if your bill is actually worth any kind of attention, then it's going to be assigned to a subcommittee. So let's say your farming bill um, makes it it's going to go from the agricultural committee to a subcommittee, and the subcommittee is where you're going to get the real research. That's where you're going to hold public hearings, you're going to ask questions from to experts, and then once those public hearings are done, you've asked your experts about what they think, what's wrong with it, what's good with it, all that stuff. Then you're going to write up the real bill. You're going to get into the debates. You're going to get into compromises and all of that stuff. And that's when you're going to write up the bill. Subcommittees are actually meant to be temporary committees. And more of these, the thing is more and more of these take on a life of their own. This is where you're going to get into the nitty gritty stuff. Because in the House, there are 93 subcommittees. And in the Senate, there are 72. And the thing is, at the subcommittee level, a bill can be altered at any time. You can have all sorts of additions made to this bill. Like, here you're going to get, like, it could be about farming, and then suddenly you're talking about, you know, random things like building roads, just random things. A bill can be changed at any time. It can also be killed at any time. So just because it's made it to the subcommittee part doesn't mean that your bill has made it. It can be killed at any time. And it's the same thing in both chambers. So it can be killed at any time. So from the subcommittee, it's sent back to the standing committee in the House, and uh, there it's going to be debated by the committee. They're going to debate the bill as it is, however it's passed, and the committee will vote on it. And if the committee votes on it and they pass it, it's going to be sent to what's known as the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee will debate it again, and they will schedule, if they debate it and it passes, they will schedule a vote. If they debate it and it dies there, then that means the rule committee has killed it and it's done. However, once the rules committee, have you lost your mind? Are you dizzy yet? Once the rule committee schedules the bill, then by that time there's a very limited debate. There's not really a whole lot more to debate because it's gone through so much debate, right? So then you have an electronic vote. Here's the thing, the difference between the House and the Senate is by the time you get to this part, The bill actually skips the Rules Committee. So the bill will go from introduction to standing committee to subcommittee to standing committee, and then it skips the Rules Committee in the Senate and goes straight to a voice vote. In the House, you have an electronic vote. In the House, you have an electronic vote because there are 435 members, and you don't want to listen to 435 people. And here's the other thing, not all 435 people vote. Some people just don't show up. And what you should do is you can look up online to see how often your congressman or congresswoman has actually shown up to vote and what they have voted on and how they have voted. You can actually look it up for yourself. And many people have not, but you can absolutely do that. And you can absolutely keep track of how often they've shown up to their committee meetings. You can keep track of what they have done, because what you'll realize is that a lot of times there are congresspeople who will be elected but not actually, you know, represent. Okay, here's the other thing. With two working versions of the same bill, um, if this is the case, if there are two working versions of the same bill, the two of them must now be reconciled. Like, you have to find a way for the two of them to be sort of compromised on. So, what Congress will do is create a conference committee so that there are members of the Senate and members of the House who come together to establish one version of the bill. And once that one version is established, the House and the Senate will vote on the bill again. So if the House passes the bill and the Senate passes the bill, then you're going to create a new committee, a conference committee, um, so that they can come up with a version that reflects both the House and the Senate. The bill's going to have, a sponsor's name from the House, a sponsor's name from the Senate, and then they'll vote. Both chambers on the vote will vote on it again, and then if it passes, it's going to go to the president for signature or for their veto. Can you see why it can take a long time for things to get done? It takes a long time for things to get done. But if it's something that is important and if it's something that people can actually get behind, you can see why it's something that is actually of value and can really matter. Um, that's the thing. What many people don't realize is that while Congress can um, be bogged down in the process of Congress, um, there are issues that can also truly, in the long run, be something that accomplishes great things for people. But again, it's a matter, however, of accountability. If the people are holding um, their representatives and their senators accountable to the work, then you can actually see whether or not the work is getting done. And with that, we'll pick up on Tuesday.